Welcome to Fringe Element here on the 440 Sports Network. My name is Braden Gall, and you can follow me on Twitter at Braden Gall.
Mine's Erin Dugan. You can follow me on Twitter at the Erin Dugan or Instagram, Erin_Dugan.
Special guest today on the show, author, AL.com, John Talty. John, how are you? Introduce yourself to everybody.
Glad to be on here. As I was telling you earlier, it's been an interesting last 24 hours or so. So I'm not trying to give home field some free pub here, but literally the only shirt I have on me right now. So, we're rolling with things.
A lot of travel. So the book, we'll do this right away. The book is The Leadership Secrets of Nick Saban. It is coming out in a couple of weeks, so make sure you pre-order it right now everywhere you get your books. Ideally, maybe your local bookstore. Maybe go do that at one of your local shops. Maybe the bookshop is a good one. Free shout for sure on that one. But John, before we do any of this, we're going to talk about Saban. We're going to talk about the last couple of weeks, Destin, obviously all the things that you learned in researching this book and what makes Nick Saban the greatest coach of all time. And we'll kind of dive deeper into the psychology of who he is and how he got to where he is.
Sure.
But we like to put our guests to work on the show.
Okay.
And we are sponsored by a sports bar in Nashville, the next evolution of a sports bar called Jasper's.
Not a normal sports bar.
It's not a normal sports bar. And Four Top Hospitality, which has got 13 locations across the Southeast, servicing Huntsville and Jackson and Flowood and Memphis and all kinds of cool places with lots of great food. So I would like you to do the copy here off the top of your head. There are no rules. So Fringe Element is brought to you, John Talty, by Jasper's.
And I just need to go with whatever I want to do from there.
One time I called it the freshwater cactus of the South.
Yeah.
Wow. That's strong.
So
you're a writer. You're a creative type. Let's see what you got.
So this segment with John Talty brought to you by Jasper's, the best place you can eat in Flowood, Mississippi. No doubt about it. I've been to Flowood. I think that is a true fact.
For sure.
This is how they want. This is the vision that they had when they started giving us money to sponsor their show. Like that, we were like, yes, the best restaurant in Flowood. That's
what their claim to fame is, from how I see it.
It's not bad, honestly.
Go to Jasper's. The parking is free. The game room is spectacular and free. You got the Papa Shot and air hockey and all kinds of great stuff. And of course, Four Top Hospitality, 13 locations across the Southeast, serving all of you SEC football fans. Okay. So before we get into the book real fast, John, do you think Nick Saban should have been suspended for the way Ross Bjork thinks for having some comments about the chaotic state of our college football ecosystem?
No, I do not. I do not think that he should have been suspended. Obviously, the SEC agreed by not suspending him. That whole thing is fascinating to me. I think my favorite part of it is that, Greg Sankey has a conversation with Jimbo Fisher before that wild press conference. So like Jimbo already has in his head, like, hey, I probably shouldn't go full crazy here. And then still was like, I'm doing it. And so that, to me, I think that was one of the fun revelations from those emails that came out, that like people warned him basically don't do this. And he still did exactly what he did.
Can't say I'm shocked.
No. And I think it speaks to, the fact that Ross Bjork and the Texas A&M president even submitted basically that ask for suspension. I think it speaks to kind of the environment of that place. Like, Ross is a very active person in terms of going after people. It's kind of a combination of those two guys. Like Jimbo wants to do it, and then Ross is like, yeah, go ahead and do it. Whereas other places, I think your AD might have stepped in and be like, maybe we shouldn't do this, where it feels like Ross was just like, yeah, go ahead and do it. Let's see where this goes. And obviously it got pretty wild.
I don't want to continue to rehash the entire thing because it's sort of ironic that they actually just agree with each other on all of this, basically, and that nothing illegal was really done. What was the vibe in Destin? We talked to Ralph Russo last week on the show. What was the vibe in Destin from your perspective? And then we'll start promoting your new product.
Yeah, I think people were waiting for fireworks, and obviously that didn't happen. I think if that could have been kept behind closed doors for maybe another week or two, maybe we would have seen that play out more in Destin, because I think it's something, from what I've heard over the last few months, this is something that has been bothering Nick Saban for a while. He has privately been grumbling to people, even sometimes not so privately, about this situation. It was obviously bothering him for a while. So it kind of felt like he was not ready to explode, but he was ready to talk about this. And so, he had an opportunity to do it in that World Games famous situation. But I think if maybe that didn't happen, it didn't leak out the way it did, maybe we would have seen more of that play out down in Destin. But it was very obvious that the SEC did not want that to overshadow the situation. And, you could tell based on the comments that both Nick Saban gave and, Jimbo Fisher over and over again saying, we're moving on. There was a reason why he was saying that. And I was strongly encouraged by the SEC to not pour more gasoline on the situation.
Are we moving on to the book, Braden?
Well, it's a perfect segue because I think chapter 2 of the book is basically how Nick Saban is batshit crazy about recruiting. And that is sort of again, and you kind of write about this, John, like we all know that 80% of your job as a head football coach is recruiting in college football right now, especially at the highest levels. But like the meticulous nature, I think, was there anything that you learned about his approach to recruiting and building a program that was new that you thought this? I can't believe this is the case. What is it that you learned about him, about recruiting specifically? Because that's obviously what's driving all of his conversations about collectives.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that before we talked to that. I do think if you read that chapter, you will understand why Nick Saban is so passionate and why he'd be willing to go against a guy who has worked for him in the past. And, by all accounts had an okay relationship with. Certainly they weren't firing bombs at each other. And whether he knew it was going to blow up the way it did, he certainly knew it would eventually get back. And he, had some pretty strong words. And so recruiting to him is everything. It's the lifeblood of college football, as we know. And I don't think anybody has embraced it quite the level that Saban has. And I think there's multiple parts to it. I think one, and you've seen some guys, leave for the NFL because they don't want to deal with it. Like, it's a constant grind. It's not for everyone. It's not a lot. It's not fun for a lot of guys. And the fact that he is still grinding the way he is at 70 years old. The man's won 7 national championships. He doesn't necessarily have to do that, but he still feels like, all right, this is kind of how I got to this level. I need to keep doing it at a certain level because there's always going to be somebody else trying to knock me off. And we've seen it with Kirby Smart, now Jimbo Fisher in the class he just signed. Like, there's always going to be people coming after Alabama. And so I think he knows he has to do it to a certain level. But I thought some of the stories in there I thought were fascinating. Just the fact that he's still so hands-on. He is, when you take a step back, he is running a massive operation here. There's a lot of people involved, a lot of players involved, a lot of coaches involved. We've talked about, and I read about in the book, he's got an army of analysts. There's just a lot of people he has to manage, but he still has basically decided, all right, this is the number one thing in our organization, getting the right players. Then I'm going to be personally involved in making sure that we get them. So we're not going to offer any kids unless I'm okay with it. I'm going to watch the film of these kids before we're okay with it. And I'm going to, want to see them in person if possible with my own eyes before we take this kid. And I think there's just a lot of coaches, especially the head coaching level, that don't do that anymore. They get to a certain point where it's just like, I'll trust my assistants, they'll do it. And Saban's like, no, this is what it's all about. I want to be involved in that. And I think that's part of why he's so good at it.
Do you think that part of that is also, and obviously as coming from Alabama, you're not really having to sell your program at this point, it sells itself. But is that because Saban just trusts his own instincts more, like trying to figure out if that kid's actually a fit? Because you talk a lot about what he does to his staff and the hiring process. And these are actually, they probably have some similarities. He runs his staff through the gamut, I think is what you said. So what is that? Is that just because his instincts, he needs to know himself that it's going to be a fit?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think part of it, there's almost like a reverse sell to these recruits at this point, because like you said, at this point, if you go to Alabama, you're going to have a really good shot to play in the NFL. If you make it to that level, you're going to have a shot to compete for a national championship, all these different things. And so they are able to be more selective at this point. And so it's almost more of are you sure you're built for this? More so than like, we need you to come play for us. It's, this is going to be incredibly hard for you. Are you sure that you actually want this? And that's from obviously an incredible position of power that they can do that. Lots of other schools, cannot do that. They just have to kind of take what they get. And I think Saban's able to say, if you come here, it's going to be the hardest thing you probably have ever done. But if you put in the work, we'll get you to where you want to be. And that's kind of the pitch that he has. And I think it's the same thing, with the coaches, because, people, and a lot of people, as I interviewed during this book, told me this, as hard as, it is for the players to play at Alabama, it's way harder for the coaches because, there's not as much direct Saban to players. There's a lot of Saban direct to the coaches. They're dealing with him all day, and it's not easy. And so that's also a a big part of it is making sure these guys fit into what we want them to do. And the fact that it's not always going to be a fun environment, but it's going to be a productive environment. And certain guys are wired to do that and certain people aren't. And that's why sometimes, you see people kind of leave or flame out after a year or two because they just don't want to work there.
We'll get into some of the anecdotes because there's my favorite one. It might not even be real about Steve Sarkisian. There was a great one about Lane Kiffin, and we'll get to some of the other ones. But I'm just curious. Let's step back for a second because there's a million books about leadership, and there's a million books about Nick Saban. What is it about the confluence of his skills and his career and Saban? Obviously, that's your beat, but like, why? Why is this the subject that you wanted to pour your heart into and take all this time and effort to write for people?
Yeah, I think anytime you see someone have a tremendous amount of success, regardless of field, I think there's always that fascination of, like, what do they do? What are they doing that maybe I'm not doing? Or how did they get to where they got to? And I think you've seen, in other fields, might be a Steve Jobs book or a movie or these different kind of powerful, influential people. You kind of wonder, like, what's the secret sauce? Like, what is that guy doing that made them so successful? And so I've always been fascinated by Saban in that regard. I think we see some ways we see what he wants us to see. And I always kind of wondered, what's it actually like behind the scenes? There are things that maybe I'm not seeing that are driving this level of success that he's had. What is it that's able to keep him at the level he's at when, again, he's 70 years old, he's making more than $10 million a year. Lots of other people would be like, I'm good. I can ease off the gas. He hasn't done that at all. And so I kind of wanted to understand the mentality behind that. And I think in general, again, with any sort of successful leader, there's something that I think you can pick up that might be helpful for you in your life or in any sort of different field, whether it's, running a Fortune 500 company, running a Publix, whatever it might be. I think there's different things that he does, at least I thought, that would transfer. And I think when I did this deep dive, I feel like that absolutely proved to be true. I think there's a lot of things he does that can help people in different areas. And just anecdotally, I feel like when I talk to people and business leaders and stuff like that, a lot of them are fascinated by Saban. The same kind of thing. They want to know, like, what is this guy doing that is leading to this, well-run organization? And so I kind of had some of that in mind too, that I feel like those kind of people will be interested in this book.
You've gotten access that a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to have. And I'm sure that whether that be with Saban himself or the coaching staff or, everybody in between, what did you do to actually hone those relationships and how do you maintain them? And is there stuff that, people get wrong? Like I know you don't want to brag on yourself, but what sets you apart in terms of access from like somebody else?
Yeah, I think it's just that I've been doing it for a bit. So I think that helps you have some familiarity with people. I think that, covering the SEC for the amount of time that I have, I feel like you have relationships around the conference, which I think help because I think it was important to not only talk to people that have, worked for Saban, played for Saban, but also people that have competed against them and people that are at other schools to kind of understand what did they see? What was hard about going up against Saban, which I thought was interesting. But I mean, it was tricky. I'm not going to lie. It was tricky. I think one of the things that I learned writing this book was not only the amount of respect that people have for Nick Saban, but also there's still some fear involved about getting on his bad side. And there were numerous people that when I reached out to that you think, all right, slam dunk, of course they're going to talk to me, that were very skittish about talking to me or had to call and ask for permission to talk to me. And that was kind of interesting. And there were times just like, like, is anybody going to talk to me for this book? And it worked out fine. But there were just times where you're like, it was interesting, people who are older than Nick Saban calling him for permission to talk to me. I didn't necessarily anticipate that happening. And I think some people he said yes to, and I think other people he said no to. And so that was kind of interesting too. The people that were willing to talk to me and the others that weren't. And
I'm sure Nick himself gave you a good couple hours sitting down, just the two of you, right? To hash out all of his secrets.
Yeah, he was very excited. No, I mean, what's interesting about it is, and I've thought about this too, is that I think for Nick Saban, so much of it is about control, right? I think he wants to control his messages. I think he wants to control, if you read this book, this is a guy who's very detail oriented. I mean, he basically has every minute of his day planned out. And so I think for him, any project that is going to not be controlled by him is always something he's going to be very skittish about being involved in. And I think I saw something similar happen. I think with the Patriots book that Seth Wickersham wrote. I think Bill Belichick kind of had a similar thing. Basically, like, I'm just going to I had nothing to do with it, take a step back, and whatever it is,
Well, so basically you're setting out to define the process, right? Like to some degree, like what makes the process? Why is it successful? And it starts, I think, very interestingly, and you write about this, and it starts interesting. It's just a psychology professor who just like has the idea and like he takes that and then turns it into like every minute of his day, right? Is that what we learned when you set out to do this? Is that's the thing you learned about Saban?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that, and I think it's sometimes we do want to pinpoint it to one thing. And so there's this one particular game in which Michigan State beats Ohio State. I think it was 1998 or so. And that's kind of what people point to as this is the moment where the process kind of set in.
It knocked him out of the national championship game. Like Ohio State would have played in the very first BCS game.
Yeah. And so it was a huge game. And I think it was the first real big kind of moment for Michigan State and Saban. He hadn't had that much success at that point. But I also think when I got to, know Saban and some of the stuff he was doing in, the 80s and 90s, even before then, I think he always had it, I think, inside him. I think that this guy was, maybe able to help him realize exactly what he was trying to do and maybe explain it in a way that maybe even Saban didn't understand what he was doing, but kind of pinpointing it in a big picture way of like, just focus on this. And I think it's very simple when you think about it. It's focus on the process, not the results. That's a very simple concept. It's obviously much harder to live your life that way every day. And that's such a huge part of what Saban does and what he is trying to instill in everyone in his organization is that we can't think about just winning national championships. We can't think about just winning SEC championships. Like we have to focus on every day is just as important as the next day. And I think you saw him reference this in the offseason recently with some of those wide receivers that he basically thought didn't step up in the moment when Jamison Williams went down in the national championship game. They had some young guys. They have to get, they're getting thrusted into the spotlight, didn't really capitalize on it. And Saban's kind of used that as an example of that's why you need to be preparing every day like it's important and not just the national championship game. And so that's such a big part of what they do. And I mean, he believes it. I've talked to people over there. Well, they'll say, it'll be April and he will almost, he will at least convince himself that if they don't do what they need to do that day, that they're going to lose to UT Chattanooga in September. He has convinced himself that like, we don't do this every day, we're going to lose and it's all going to fall apart, which maybe is not the most like fun way to live your life, but it's obviously been incredibly successful. And that's, so much of what powers that organization is that kind of mantra.
It's interesting that a minute ago to me, you were talking about people being afraid of not having like a second chance or getting on Saban's bad side. But one of the chapters of your book is called like what happens when you give distressed athletes another chance or giving distressed athletes another chance. Can you talk a little bit about that and like the thought behind it?
Yeah. And so, I think people also refer to it as like the Nick Saban, like Rehabilitation Center. And I think he has done a really good job of, capitalizing on what I think is really like a market inefficiency. It really started with Mike Groh, who I think now is with the Giants. His dad was Al Groh, the former Jets coach and UVA coach. And Mike Groh got fired. I think he was about 30 years old, UVA offensive coordinator, trying to figure out what to do. And Saban had the idea of kind of bringing him on as essentially like an intern, graduate assistant. This guy was just an offensive coordinator in the ACC, brings in Mike Groh in this very, low level role, but Groh likes it. Saban seems to think it worked out well. And then it seems to spark kind of an idea in his head that we can get some of these guys who have value to come into our organization. They bring what, the skills they have. We get them at a super discounted rate. We're not asking them to do that much. And we've seen, Butch Jones, Steve Sarkisian started that way. Mike Loxley, Billy Napier. Guys who have gone on to have a lot of success initially came into the Alabama organization as analysts. And I think it took a lot of foresight for him to see that potential. And I think it also, one of the things that I think Saban is really good at is that he's not worried about putting big personalities in a room. He's not worried about losing power. And of course, all the success he's had helps with that. But, he hires Bill O'Brien, a guy who was an NFL head coach, for, a decade or so before that. that's a big personality. That's an alpha guy from everything I've heard. And like Saban's just not worried about it. Like we're going to butt heads sometimes, but that's fine. I think you bring value to our organization, we'll do it. And I think there are a lot of other coaches that don't do that. You see a lot of other leaders that don't do that. They surround themselves with yes people or people that are just going to give them what they want. And Saban's the opposite of that. He wants people that will challenge him. He wants people that bring different skills to the table. And so I think that's been incredibly successful for them, obviously. And they've got a whole factory at this point in which people you get fired and they get a big buyout and they probably end up at in Alabama in a year or two. I mean, it just seems to every year there's some big name that's there.
We're gonna pay you because you couldn't beat Alabama. Now we're gonna pay you to go work for Alabama and beat us again. I think there's a line in there somewhere about that.
And somebody at a different school said like, we're basically paying them to beat us twice. And it is wild.
It's ridiculous.
Like Butch Jones in some ways gets fired because he can't beat Alabama, right? And so they pay him, I think, $8 or $9 million, if not more, in a buyout. And then he just goes to Alabama and helps Alabama. It's kind of wild. And I could see it being very frustrating for other organizations that, that they have to deal with that because it's such a machine over there at this point.
All right. I want to get to Sark because that's my single favorite sentence in the entire book. I want to get to Sark, but because you kind of mention it, you roll the grenade out there and then you kind of move on pretty quickly. But I want to get to that in a second. But I'm curious because you cover the whole league. And there's so much out there that is Saban now, right? Whether it's Mel Tucker or Cristobal or Napier or Kirby Smart now, or, whatever, there's dozens of them now. Who do you think has sort of taken all of the stuff that you wrote about? Who are the guys that are you better now able to analyze how good a job Billy Napier is going to do at Florida or whatever, because you now understand the Saban system a little bit more and the process that you can kind of judge, all right, these are the guys that know Jimbo Fisher is another one. Like how has this given you insight into the other coaches now?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is that Kirby has embraced it the most. And obviously they just won a national championship. So that's an easy, obvious answer. But I think even before they won that, I would have still said Kirby, in part just because I think he has the same relentless attitude when it comes to recruiting. I think, and I write about it in the book, after Kirby went to Georgia, there was kind of ruffled some feathers back at Alabama because he took some of the Alabama recruiting evaluations and used them against Alabama. Kind of like, hey, this is what Alabama thinks about you. This is where you're on their board. We have you here in our board, which is kind of a ruthless move. But that's kind of, I think Saban, was both upset about and probably respected it a little bit. I think that I always thought Kirby was the one who had that kind of relentless attitude that was most similar to Saban and just wants to win. And obviously he's the first one to win a national championship out of kind of the current most recent crop. Obviously Jimbo did at Florida State earlier. I think Billy fits a lot of it too. He did it at a smaller level. And so I think we're all curious to how it translates, but I thought he did a really good job of taking pieces of the process and using it with the resources he had at Louisiana. I think a lot of people think that he is very similar in terms of attention to detail as Saban. I feel like he talks a little different, he acts a little different, but there's a lot of the kind of inner DNA that I think is similar to how Saban does things at Alabama. And obviously Jimbo's had a lot of success, though it doesn't seem like he would want to claim any of that right now. I know he made it a point to talk about much more Bobby Bowden influence than Nick Saban, but there's no doubt that he obviously has been influenced by Saban as well in their time together at LSU. And again, I think we'll see what Billy does at Florida, but if you look at Saban, Kirby, Jimbo, those are the top three recruiters in the SEC. And again, it just all eventually kind of comes back to that. Either you can recruit at that level or you can't. And we saw some other, Saban disciples over the years, Derek Dooley and, some of these other guys who they just didn't have that in them. They didn't have that ability to grind every day to sign the top recruiting classes. And that's why some of them failed.
I think that's what Cristobal is going to be able to do at Miami, frankly, if he gets the resources to do it. So Erin, go ahead.
It does seem like there's a direct, and this isn't necessarily a question, but it does seem like there's a direct correlation kind of between the guy, and I know Jimbo and Saban have been loud lately, but as a general rule, they're not, the Dan Mullen of the SEC that's out in front of everything being loud. They're not Lane Kiffin. It's like they're putting their head down and they're in love with that, or made themselves fall in love with that day-to-day, I guess, grind, for lack of a better word, just every single thing falling in place. And you bring up Bill Belichick, I think of Tim Corbin, of like those people that are just every single day you like rinse and repeat. And so if you had to put your finger on it, would you say that and recruiting and then that daily grind, are those the two most important things?
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of it. And one of the chapters I get into, I forget the exact chapter name, but basically it's how Saban is almost like a thoroughbred racehorse, that he almost has blinders on. Like he has this really unique ability to, when he's in the office, if he's in an hour meeting, he is locked into that hour meeting. He's not thinking, oh man, what am I going to have for dinner later? Or like, I probably need to call Miss Terry back after this meeting. Like he's just locked in. Whatever he needs to do in that meeting, he is doing. And, you can just see, I mean, he's not on Twitter. He's not on Facebook. Like I think we all, for what we do, love Lane Kiffin and all the theatrics that he brings to the table. But like, if you just think about how much time he's probably wasted on Twitter, now I guess his dog has a Twitter account. Like Nick Saban's dog is not going to have a Twitter account, and that's not to say Lane Kiffin's bad at what he does, because he's obviously not, but there's just a different priority in terms of what they want to do. And so, and I think, in some ways he's so intense that you do hear some stories that sometimes rub people the wrong way. I've heard stories from people where, he's walking down the hallway and you pass by him and like, he doesn't say hello to you, and people are like, man, it's kind of rude. Like, why does this guy do this? And then like, I talk to other people who, like him, and maybe this is a favorable take on it, but that like, he's so locked into whatever he's doing. He literally does not even see you. Like he is just in his own world, and he just did not even see you walk past him. And that's just, that's just who he is. And so, again, that can rub some people the wrong way, but it's been really important to, I think, the success he's had, that he can do whatever he needs to do in that moment fully. And then when it's done, it's almost like he closes the drawer and it's like, all right, that's done. Next thing, open that drawer, and just goes bit by bit over the course of his entire day. There was a great coach here in Nashville, Lipscomb, one of the greatest basketball coaches of all time, Don Meyer, the late, great Don Meyer. And he always said to everybody, like, what are you going to do next? Doesn't matter if you had a dunk or a 3-pointer or bounce the ball off your foot. It's all about what are you going to do next? And I do feel like the process boils down to like literally what's going to happen next in your life in the next 10 seconds. Like focus on those 10 seconds being great. And then you can worry about the next 10 seconds after that. And it's like breaking the world down into these minute details, which is fascinating because you bring up Kiffin, and it's so interesting to me that Kiffin is such a polar opposite in almost every sense of how he operates and functions, but it's also what Alabama needed to become Alabama and what they are today. And then of course it didn't end well. Of course it didn't last. Like it's when you meet a significant other and you have a really great time, and then you both realize like, this isn't going to work. It's so fascinating to me how important a role he plays in all of this. And then of course to be like taking calls in the middle of practice meetings and stuff. Yeah, it ended poorly at the end. And I think one of the former players that I quoted in the book says that Lane was basically a ticking time bomb. Like they knew eventually it was going to blow up. It's just, you're hoping to get as much success as you can out of him before he blows up. But yeah, I mean, those guys, not to get too old school here, but almost like the classic odd couple, like they're just two very different guys. They're wired very differently. What they like to do is very differently. And you just saw that play out. But I think, like you said, I think it's exactly what Alabama needed at that time. I think that they needed to evolve. I think Kiffin was the perfect guy to do that for them. And I think it says a lot about both of those guys that I think they probably knew going in, this is not really my guy, and this is not my guy, and Kiffin's talked about, working for Pete Carroll and coming up that way. Incredibly different than Nick Saban. Some of the offensive coordinators Nick Saban had before, Kiffin. Jim McElwain, good coach, fits more of probably that Saban style. Kiffin is very different from that. But I think they both kind of realized, all right, I'm probably going to be out of my comfort zone with you a lot, but I think it's probably going to help our organization. It's probably going to help our players to do what you bring to the table, what I bring to the table. And I think Kiffin learned a lot from Saban. I think Saban learned a lot from Kiffin, and they obviously had a lot of success at a time where I think it was really important for them. There was and I write about this in the book, around that time was when the famous, the dynasty is dead talk was starting to happen. They lose in 2014 to Ohio State. 2015, they lose to Ole Miss when they started Cooper Bateman, which just looking back on it, is still such a weird thing. I remember being at that game and just being, what is happening here? But there was that moment where people felt like, man, Alabama's slipping here. What's happening? And Kiffin, I think, was a big part of getting them back on top. They win the national championship in 2015. And then, obviously they continue their run on ripping off some more national championships after that. But Kiffin was a key part of that. Which brings us right to Sark, because all these 4 questions, the last 4 or 5 questions we've talked about, which is attention to detail, reclamation projects on the coaching staff, and frankly, rebuilding the dynasty after sort of like 18 and 19, right? Where they don't get the job done against
Clemson and they get blown out, and then they don't get the job done against LSU, and LSU takes over. And then we get to 2020, which is Sark. And there's a line in the book where you say that Nick Saban, and again, I'll paraphrase here, you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, that basically he was offering Sarkisian head coach in waiting status, for lack of a better term, that Steve Sarkisian could actually have been the guy that took over at Alabama. Do you actually believe that was a real thing, or just a tactic to keep Sarkisian in Alabama and not take the Texas job?
Great question.
It is a really good question.
I think there's two things there. I'll say one, I think that like Saban had an incredible amount of respect for Sark. I mean, really, really, really liked the guy. And I think, head coaching and waiting stuff, or wherever that kind of works, like that always gets tricky and messy. And so, we've seen it play out for other people. But I think the way that how it was kind of framed to me, especially it was around the same time that Auburn wanted to interview Sark. And he was one of their top candidates. Obviously, they're hiring Brian Harsin, and that's a whole nother story for another day. But I think that there could be a little bit of both. I think of, hey, if you play your cards right here, like you could be the guy to replace me. And is that in part to, hey, don't take that Auburn job? Maybe that's part of it. But it's also, they were prepared to really bump up his salary too. He was going to make a lot of money. He was already making a lot of money, but he was going to make even more. So I know that they thought very highly of him, Saban in particular, and was willing to go to bat for him. And so, I think that would have been really interesting in a few years from now, if Sark was still there, how that would have played out. But I think especially when Texas got involved, it's too good of a job, I think, to pass up. But, if Texas never comes in and it's just an Auburn situation, that could have swayed Sark to wait it out, and see if he could, be the guy to replace the guy.
I saw that Feinbaum, which is a very high compliment because Paul says what he wants to, but he called your book an absolute masterpiece, which I'm just gonna make you really uncomfortable and brag on you. Sure. But and although maybe Jimbo isn't gonna pick it up and really dive into it, a lot of people that are, have a name in sports have been highly complimentary of what you've been able to do. What did you find? I'm fascinated by the process that this had to have taken you to get there. What did you find to be the most difficult part of writing this?
Well, I hope that you both think it's an absolute masterpiece as well. We'll let the people be the judge of that. Yeah, it's interesting. So this is the first book I ever wrote. So there's always going to be that challenge of figuring out, kind of the rhythm of how to do things. That was an interesting part of it. I think, as I mentioned earlier, you just don't know what the kind of reaction you're going to get until you do it. And so you start reaching out to people, and then people are like, yeah, I'll call you tomorrow. And then just ghost you. And you're like, uh-oh, this might be a little trickier of a book than I thought it was going to be. And then I think the other thing, I think it was both a good and bad thing for me, was that, writing it during the pandemic, it eliminated a lot of opportunities to spend time with people in person, which would have been something that I would have done. I would have done a lot more travel. There's a lot of events that I would have gone to, get interviews with people and stuff like that. Wasn't able to do that. I think where maybe it helped me a little bit was maybe more people had time to do long phone interviews. And so did a lot of ththose where, you're talking to people for 3-4 hours, where I don't know if they would have committed that much time to me, but they're like, well, it's a pandemic. What else am I doing? And so I think that kind of helped and hurt me in both ways. But it's just, it's challenging in any way. You're trying to take this guy and, encapsulate who he is and what he does. And, you hope that you did it as accurately and fairly as possible. And, trying to put enough stuff in this book that people will find interesting, but also, it's not meant to be, a gossipy type book. Maybe somebody will do that one down the line, but I think it's just meant to, have really interesting stuff. I hope there's a lot of stuff that people have never read before. At least there's a lot of stuff that I had never heard before that I put in there. So I hope people find that as well. But, just trying to incorporate all that different stuff was tricky.
Yeah, it's a complex system, like you mentioned. We're asking you, what are the two most important things, like recruiting and the process, but it's just so much more complex than that.
And John, I don't think anybody doesn't know a lot of the big picture stuff you write about. I think what is interesting is learning how it all works on sort of a granular level. When we talk about like bringing in coaches or recruiting certain players or recruiting in general, or the process, or fourth quarter conditioning programs, or getting started in Ohio and then Michigan State, and his relationship with Jimmy Sexton. There's all this stuff that sort of bakes in and becomes who this person is. Is there anything about second and 26? Is there anything about the championship game in there that people should be excited about?
Yeah, so I think it's one of my favorite chapters is looking at how absolutely obsessed Nick Saban is about being prepared. And so one of my favorite anecdotes, which I mean, I had never heard before, I doubt other people have, this guy who worked for him at Toledo, he answers his phone. It's Christmas Day, and Nick Saban, his boss at the time, calls him. It's like, hey, like LC, like, what are you doing? And he's like, I mean, it's like Christmas Day. I'm hanging out with my wife. And he's like, you want to come over and watch some film? And he's just like, it's Christmas, man. Like, are you trying to get me divorced? He's like, what? You don't want to come over and watch film with me right now? Like, Saban was like dead serious. Like, just like, what else are you doing? It's Christmas. Come over and watch film. And like, that to me speaks to who that guy is to some extent. Like, he is some ways just wild in how much he wants to be prepared. But I think it stems from, just wanting to be prepared for any situation. And so I think when we think to 2nd and 26, one of the most famous plays probably in college football history, Saban's been part of another one, kick six, which he probably isn't as happy to remember. But 2nd and 26, we're always just going to think about, wow, like Saban had that really wild, out of characteristic decision to bench Jalen at halftime and put Tua in. But I think it's actually really shows all that went, if you know kind of what went behind the scenes, it was really all a long buildup. It wasn't a, decision in the heat of the battle. Yeah. This was building for a long time, and they saw a lot behind the scenes that when the time comes, we're going to have to do this at some point. And Jalen was always able to kind of find a way to hold on, but it was wobbly for a long time. And so I just think that it's such a great example of kind of why Saban does what he does, why he puts so much emphasis on the preparation, so that in that moment, when you're down big in a national championship game, that you can feel confident based on all the work you've done leading up to it, to put in a true freshman in that situation and think that he can help you. And obviously he did, and they win in that famous way in overtime. But I think that's, it's just different compared to what people might know about it.
The book, The Leadership Secrets of Nick Saban. It's your first book. Congratulations, on newsstands here coming out in a couple of weeks. So pre-order it right now, everywhere you get your books. John, one more time. Fringe Element is a podcast about SEC football, and it's brought to you by Jaspers. Okay? Jaspers.
Do you want me to do a different one this time?
If you can, you got about 30 seconds.
You're really using them.
I know. I'm trying to do my best. Fringe Element is a podcast brought to you by Jaspers. I don't even know what their food is. They have
awesome. It's awesome. It's amazing.
It's awesome. They have my favorite old fashioned anywhere I've been.
There you go.
They do have good old fashioned.
I hope they do. That is my favorite drink. So I hope they do.
Follow them on Twitter. Order the book. Go to AL.com. Go to our YouTube page at 440 Sports. Follow Erin Dugan as well. My name is Braden Gall. Thank you guys all for hanging out with us. This has been Fringe Element here on the 440 Sports Network.